Imagine you're in medieval England. You've just committed a crime. Maybe you killed a man in a brawl. Maybe you stole a loaf of bread. It doesn't matter. The sheriff and his men are after you. You hear them shouting, "You know what happens if they catch you? It could be a hanging. It could be a mutilation. You have one chance. You run. You run as fast as you can to the nearest church. If you can make it inside, if you can just touch the altar or the sanctuary ring on the door, you are safe. For now, you have claimed sanctuary. This was a real thing. It was a core part of life and law in the Middle Ages. The idea of sanctuary was simple. A church was holy ground. It was God's house. The king's law stopped at the church door. Inside, a fugitive was under the protection of the church. He could not be arrested or harmed without committing a grave sin, a sacrilege against God himself. This wasn't just a nice custom, it was a recognized legal right. Where did this idea come from? It's old, very old. You can find traces of it in ancient Greece and Rome. Temples were often seen as places of refuge. But for medieval Europe, the roots were mainly biblical. The Old Testament talks about cities of refuge. These were 6 cities set aside where someone who had accidentally killed another person could flee. They could live there, safe from the victim's family, who might be seeking revenge. This concept of a safe place, protected by divine authority, resonated deeply with early Christians. As Christianity spread across Europe, the idea attached itself to churches. Early church councils made it official. Bishops and priests argued that God's mercy should be available to all, even sinners. A church was a house of mercy. Dragging a man out of a church to hang him seemed like a violation of that mercy. It was a direct challenge to the church's authority and its spiritual role in the world. So sanctuary became a strange mix of law and religion. It was part of the common law of England, but it was enforced by the spiritual power of the church. A king who violated sanctuary risked excommunication. That was a serious threat. It meant being cut off from the church, from the sacraments, and, in the eyes of the people, from salvation itself. A king's subjects might even feel their oaths of loyalty to him were no longer valid. So, most of the time, kings and their officials respected the church's protection. The system wasn't about letting criminals go free. That's a common misunderstanding. It was more like a pause button. It stopped immediate, often violent justice. It gave the fugitive time. Time to confess, time to negotiate, and time to choose their fate. It inserted a moment of reflection and due process into a legal system that was often brutal and swift. When a person claimed sanctuary, they had to follow a set of rules. They couldn't just live in the church forever. The protection was temporary. It was a chance to find a solution that didn't involve the gallows. The church wasn't a prison, but it wasn't a hotel either. The fugitive, now called a sanctuary man, had to stay within the church grounds. In some large cathedrals, this might mean a specific precinct with its own buildings. In a small village church, it might just be the church itself. The local parish had to feed him, but they often did so grudgingly. This right was open to almost anyone for almost any crime. Murderers, thieves, debtors, political enemies of the king. All could seek refuge. There were a few exceptions, like treason or sacrilege, crimes considered so bad that they even violated God's peace. But for the most part, the doors of the church were open. This created a fundamental tension. You had 2 systems of power existing side by side. The king's law, or common law, wanted to punish criminals and maintain order. The church's law, or canon law, wanted to offer mercy and protect its sacred spaces. For centuries, these 2 forces were locked in a constant push and pull. Sanctuary was the place where that conflict became most visible. It was a physical space where a person could literally step from the king's world into God's world, and for a short time, God's world won. So what actually happened when someone claimed sanctuary? It wasn't just a matter of running into a building and hiding. There was a process, a formal ritual that had to be followed. It all started with the run. The chase was everything. The fugitive had to reach the consecrated ground of a church or abbey before the law caught him. In some places, the boundaries of sanctuary were marked with special crosses, called sanctuary crosses. As long as you were within that boundary, you were safe. Some famous churches had large bronze knockers or rings on their main doors. The fugitive would bang on the door, waking the watchman who lived in the church for this very purpose. Grasping that ring was the symbolic act of placing yourself under the church's protection. The Great Sanctuary Knocker on the door of Durham Cathedral is a famous example. Its grim, monstrous face looks like it has seen centuries of desperate men. Once inside, the church bells would be rung. This was a public announcement. It told the whole town that someone had taken sanctuary. It was a signal to the sheriff and his men to back off. They would often surround the church, waiting, but they could not enter to make an arrest. The fugitive was now officially a sanctuary seeker. The next step was confession. The person had to confess their crime. They didn't confess to a priest, as you might expect. They confessed to the coroner. The coroner was a royal official, the keeper of the king's pleas. He would be summoned to the church. There, in front of witnesses, the fugitive would admit what he had done. His confession was written down. This was a crucial step. By confessing, he was admitting his guilt under the king's law. But he was doing it from a place where that law couldn't touch him. Now came the choice. The fugitive was safe inside the church for 40 days. During this time, he had two options. Option 1, leave the church and stand trial. Given that he had just confessed, this was basically a death sentence for any serious crime. Very few people chose this. Option 2 was the more common choice. It was called abjuration of the realm. This meant the fugitive had to swear an oath to leave England and never return without the king's permission. To come back without permission was a felony, and he could be killed on sight. It was a form of self-imposed exile. If he chose abjuration, a whole new ceremony began. He would be stripped to his shirt. He would be handed a wooden cross to carry. This was to show he was a penitent and still under the protection of the church. The coroner would then assign him a port, a specific coastal town he had to travel to. He was given a set number of days to get there. Then came the journey. This was a dangerous public spectacle. The sanctuary man had to walk barefoot and bareheaded from his church to the port. He had to stay on the main highway. If he strayed from the road, he lost his protection and could be arrested or killed. He was an outcast. People would see him, this man in his simple tunic holding a cross, and know exactly what he was. He was a confessed criminal, walking away from his home, his family, and his life forever. Once he reached the port, he had to present himself to the authorities there. He then had to take the first available ship heading out of England. He couldn't choose his destination. He just had to get on a boat and go. If no ship was available, he had to walk into the sea up to his knees every day as a sign that he was still trying to leave. He was in a state of limbo, no longer truly part of the kingdom, waiting to be cast out. This whole process was a powerful piece of legal and social theater. It resolved the central conflict of sanctuary. The church got to show its mercy and protect its authority. The fugitive escaped death, and the kingdom got rid of a confessed criminal. It was a strange, harsh, but effective compromise. It wasn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. Abjuration was a social death. It was a brutal punishment, just one that stopped short of the hangman's noose. For the person involved, the choice was stark death by hanging, or a new life as a penniless exile in a foreign land. In facement, that you most chose the walk to the sea. Who were the people who sought sanctuary? It's easy to picture a desperate murderer, blood on his hands, bursting through the church doors. And that certainly happened. Homicide was one of the most common reasons for claiming sanctuary. In a time when many men carried knives and tempers flared easily, a tavern brawl could quickly turn deadly. Sanctuary offered a way out from the mandatory death sentence for murder. But it wasn't just killers. A huge variety of people used this system. Thieves were common sanctuary seekers. If you were caught stealing goods worth more than a shilling, the punishment was death. A shilling was not a lot of money. Stealing a sheep could get you hanged, so a thief who feared being caught would run for the church just like a murderer would. Debtors also used sanctuary. If a person couldn't pay their debts, they could be thrown into a horrible prison until their family paid up. For a poor man with no family to help, this was a life sentence in dreadful conditions. Some major sanctuaries, especially in London, became havens for debtors. They could live inside the sanctuary precinct, safe from their creditors. They could even continue to conduct business from within the safe zone. This created strange little communities of people living just beyond the reach of the law. And then there was politics. Sanctuary was a powerful tool for those who found themselves on the wrong side of the king or a powerful noble. In the turbulent years of the Wars of the Roses, for example, sanctuary was used frequently by high-ranking figures. After a lost battle, the losing side's leaders would flee to the nearest great abbey. Queen Elizabeth Woodville, wife of King Edward IV, twice took sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. The first time was when the Lancastrians briefly retook the throne. She went there with her daughters, a pregnant and terrified queen. She even gave birth to her son, the future King Edward V, while living in sanctuary. She knew that even her enemies would hesitate to violate the sanctity of such a powerful church. The places themselves were as varied as the people. Technically, any parish church offered sanctuary. A fugitive could run to the small, simple church in his own village, but these smaller churches only offered the standard 40-day protection, leading to the choice of trial or exile. Some places were different. There were special chartered sanctuaries. These were usually great cathedrals or abbeys that had been granted special privileges by the king in a royal charter. Places like Westminster Abbey in London, Durham Cathedral in the north, or Beverley Minster in Yorkshire. These chartered sanctuaries offered a much more powerful form of protection. In these places, sanctuary could be permanent. A fugitive could live within the sanctuary grounds for the rest of his life. They were like small, self-governing towns, immune to the king's law. They had their own houses, their own shops, and their own rules. The area around Westminster Abbey became a famous sanctuary zone known as Alsatia. It developed a reputation as a slum, a crowded and unruly place filled with criminals, debtors, and all sorts of people on the run. Life inside these sanctuary communities was complex. The people living there were known as sanctuary men or sanctuary women. They were a mixed bunch. Some were hardened criminals who continued to prey on people outside the sanctuary's borders, using it as a safe base of operations. Others were just people down on their luck, trying to rebuild some kind of life in the only place that would have them. They formed their own society, with its own hierarchies and codes of conduct. The church officials who ran the sanctuary had to act as a kind of government, trying to keep order among their unusual residents. These great sanctuaries were powerful symbols of the church's independence. Durham was a classic example. The Bishop of Durham was a prince-bishop. He ruled the north of England almost like his own king. His cathedral sanctuary was a key part of his authority. To violate Durham's sanctuary was to challenge not just the church, but the bishop's personal power. The very landscape of these places spoke of protection and defiance. They were fortresses of faith, offering refuge to a wide cross-section of medieval society, from terrified queens to common horse thieves. Sanctuary was never a smooth or universally accepted system. It was a constant source of friction. It created deep and lasting conflicts between the two great powers of the medieval world, the church and the crown. Kings and their governments had a love-hate relationship with sanctuary. On one hand, they were usually pious men who respected the church's authority. They understood that violating a holy place was a terrible sin. On the other hand, they were responsible for keeping law and order. And sanctuary made that job very difficult. From a king's point of view, sanctuary was a loophole in the justice system. It allowed known criminals, even confessed murderers, to escape punishment. This undermined the king's authority and made the law look weak. This tension boiled over many times. A powerful king might decide that a particular criminal was too dangerous to be protected, or that a political enemy was too important to be allowed to escape. In these cases, the king's men might surround a church and try to starve the fugitive out. This was a legal gray area. They weren't technically violating the sanctuary by force, but they were making it impossible for the person to survive. Sometimes the king's frustration led to outright violence. The most famous example of this conflict is connected to the murder of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in 1170. Becket wasn't a sanctuary seeker himself, but he was a fierce defender of the church's rights against King Henry II. When four of the king's knights murdered him inside his own cathedral, it sent a shockwave across Europe. They had killed an archbishop at his own altar. It was the ultimate violation of a sacred space. The public outrage was so immense that Henry II was forced to perform a public penance, walking barefoot to Canterbury and allowing himself to be whipped by monks. This event cemented the idea of the church as an inviolable space in the public imagination for centuries. But less famous violations happened all the time. Sheriffs would sometimes get impatient and drag a man out of a church. This would lead to a major clash with the local bishop. The sheriff could be excommunicated. The church itself might be placed under an interdict, meaning no services, no baptisms, no burials could be performed there until the sin was atoned for. This put immense pressure on the local community to respect the sanctuary rules. The system also caused problems at a local level. Imagine you were a law-abiding villager. Your neighbor is a known troublemaker. One day, he gets into a fight and kills someone. He runs 50 yards to the parish church and claims sanctuary. Now he's living there. The parish is legally obligated to provide him with food and water for 40 days. You have to look at this man, a confessed killer, living in the heart of your community, being fed by your own resources. You can imagine the resentment that would build. In the chartered sanctuaries, where criminals could live permanently, the problems were even worse. These sanctuary communities were often seen as nests of criminals. Residents of London complained bitterly about the lawlessness in places like Westminster or St. Martin's le Grand. They argued that these sanctuaries made the whole city more dangerous. Thieves and thugs could commit crimes in the city, then simply run back to their safe zone where the city watch couldn't follow. This created a sense of injustice. Why should one group of people be able to live outside the law just because they were physically located on church land? There was also fraud. People would abuse the system. A debtor might claim sanctuary to avoid paying people he genuinely owed money to. A criminal might use the 40 days to have his friends bribe witnesses or intimidate a jury. The system, designed to provide mercy, could be manipulated by the cunning and the corrupt. So while sanctuary served an important purpose, it was far from perfect. It was a messy, complicated institution that was constantly being tested and challenged. It represented a fundamental disagreement about where true authority came from, God or the king. For much of the Middle Ages, there was no clear answer to that question. Sanctuary was the battleground where that conflict was fought, not with armies, but with legal arguments, desperate fugitives, and the heavy wooden doors of a church. Like many medieval institutions, sanctuary could not last forever. The world was changing. The ideas that had supported the right of sanctuary for centuries began to weaken. Its slow decline and eventual death was a story of shifting power, new ideas about law, and a changing relationship between the church and the state. The beginning of the end came with the Tudors. The Tudor kings, starting with Henry VII, were obsessed with law and order. They wanted to build a strong centralized state where the king's law was absolute. The messy, conflicting jurisdictions of the Middle Ages were an obstacle to this vision. And sanctuary was one of the messiest. It was a direct challenge to the idea that there was one law for all of England. Where Henry VII began to chip away at sanctuary's power, he argued successfully that it should not apply to treason. A man who plotted against the king, he claimed, was an enemy of the kingdom itself and could not be protected by the church. This was a small change, but it was significant. It showed that the king could start making exceptions. The real hammer blow came from his son, Henry VIII. Henry's motives were complex. He was engaged in his famous power struggle with the Pope over his desire to divorce Catherine of Aragon. This struggle led him to break with the Roman Catholic Church entirely and declare himself the supreme head of the Church of England. This one act fundamentally changed the balance of power. The Church in England was no longer an independent international power that could stand up to the king. It was now under the king's direct control. With the Church weakened, its ancient privileges were vulnerable. In the 1530s, as part of his dissolution of the monasteries, Henry's government took a hard look at sanctuary. Thomas Cromwell, his chief minister, saw it as an outdated and chaotic system that encouraged crime. In 1540, a major law was passed that drastically reformed sanctuary. The new law abolished sanctuary for the most serious crimes. Murder, rape, burglary, arson, and highway robbery were no longer protected. This removed the main group of people who had used the system. The number of chartered sanctuaries was also slashed. Only a handful of towns were designated as official sanctuaries, and life for those inside them was made much stricter. They had to wear badges, obey a curfew, and practice a trade. They were less like refugees and more like inmates in an open prison. The religious justification for sanctuary was also eroding. The Protestant Reformation brought new ways of thinking. The idea of a church building as a magically protected space, where God's law overruled man's law, began to seem like a superstition to some Protestant reformers. They emphasized faith and scripture over rituals and holy places. Justice, they argued, was a good thing, a godly thing. A system that helped criminals avoid justice was not. The decline continued under Henry's children. During the short reign of the Protestant Edward VI, sanctuary was almost completely abolished. His Catholic sister, Queen Mary I, briefly restored it as part of her attempt to bring back the old religion. But when Queen Elizabeth came to the throne, the trend of limiting it resumed. The final end came under King James. By the early 1600s, England was a very different country from the one where sanctuary had taken root. The state was stronger, the legal system more developed. The idea of a church being a legal safe zone seemed absurd to the legal minds of the day. In 1623, Parliament passed an act that abolished sanctuary for all criminal offenses. The statute's title was blunt: an act for the furthering of justice in criminal cases. After more than 1,000 years, the right to run to a church and escape the law was gone. A few sanctuary privileges for civil cases, like debt, lingered on for a few more decades, but the great medieval tradition was effectively dead. What was its legacy? The idea of sanctuary didn't disappear completely. It survives in our language. We still talk about finding sanctuary, or a place being a sanctuary. We mean a place of peace and safety. The concept of political asylum, where a person can flee persecution in their home country and find safety in another, has some of its deepest roots in this old tradition. It's the idea that there should be some place a person can go when they are in desperate trouble, a place where a higher law of mercy can step in. Medieval sanctuary was a product of its time. It was a messy, imperfect, and often frustrating system. It tried to balance the demands of justice with the ideals of mercy. For centuries, it offered a slim chance of survival to thousands of people, from kings to commoners, who found themselves on the wrong side of the law. It was a powerful reminder that in the medieval world, the king's power was not absolute. There was another power, the power of God, and its authority began at the church door.